So if I can invite up, please, Josh Rains, Managing Director at Geodata, Louise Irvine, Senior Knowledge Development Lawyer at Forsters, Stuart Tim, who's a planning lawyer and a partner at Knights, and Paul Marshall, Senior Consultant at Landmark Geodata. Josh, do you want the mic or are you mic'd up?
All right, so the first things first, I am speaking to people, so I will say please, and I will say thank you, and I will not give you guys an example of a good answer while I ask the question, so don't worry about that side of things. But let's start things. First things first, my name's Josh Rains. I'm Managing Director for Landmark Geodata, a peer business unit of SearchFlow, and really pleased to be joined by the panel here today, who I will now ask to introduce themselves, talk a bit about yourselves, your background and your role within your organisations. And Stu, we'll start with you, please.
Well, thank you, Josh. My name's Stuart Tim. I'm a partner at Knights PLC. We're one of the few non-partner law firms as a listed PLC. I'm a specialist in planning law. I always like to make that clear because Knights has both town planners and planning lawyers, and I'm very much on the legal side. I've been doing it 15, 20 years and have a mixture of local authority experience for 5-6 years around the East Midlands and in-house and commercial private sector experience. Last year or so, I was ranked in Planning Magazine's top 20 planning lawyers.
Louise.
Waiting for a round of applause. Yeah, hi, I'm Louise Irvine. I'm a Senior Knowledge Development Lawyer at Forsters in the Commercial Real Estate team. And a key part of my role these days is helping to head up our property sustainability group. So that brings across lawyers from our commercial property, residential and rural property teams, as well as planning, construction and banking. So it's really grown a lot in terms of what we do. We've just recently divided our sustainability group into 6 different specialisms, and I've got them written down just in case I forget one. So we look at biodiversity, drafting for a sustainable future, electric vehicle charging points, renewable energy and infrastructure, green regs and certifications, and natural capital, and we advise across a wide range of clients. So we've got both occupiers, institutional investors and developers across most of the commercial spheres, so the living sector, retail and main development, and quite a lot of rural work as well. So it's gone from not having a lot of sustainability work as a KDL to taking up a huge part of my day job.
And Paul.
Fantastic. Hello everyone, Paul Marshall. I'm a senior consultant in our Landmark Geodata division. My role really consists of doing a deep dive regularly into Landmark's data holdings and making sure we bring that to market at the point people need it, how they need it, with the licensing behind to be compliant for their use. With the idea really that we help people speed up their decision making, we help risk identification, risk demystifying, and we create propositions in Geodata to do just that. Fabulous.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I think when I look at the title list of planning, let's just double check I get it right, planning for a sustainable future, whenever the word sustainable is put into a title of a panel, you can talk around a whole host of activities. And when we say planning for that, we can talk around internally, the industry, the markets, and everything across those. So I think what you're here today, or I hope you're here today, is as we walk across this, we'll talk through a lot of various subjects. And the real objective that we want to do today is, one, give some insightful sort of answers across some of these topics, but also encourage that discussion during this. So we've got an opportunity to ask questions to the panel at the end, but also into the session that follows in the rooftop bar. I'm sure we can drum up some discussion on that. So let's get started into a few more sort of focused questions, I guess, on that sort of things. And the first one really being, when we talk around sustainability, what does that sort of mean from your perspective? And Stuart, if we start from your side with the focus on that planning side, what does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say on that, but I'll probably just respond to your first point, really, is that maybe, as a planning lawyer, I put the emphasis at the start of that sentence as well. My expertise is planning, so it's very much the planning side and how that leads into sustainability. But in answer to that question, the first thing I'd check the dictionary. What does sustainability mean? It means meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in that sense, it's about balance, balancing out what you put in against what you get out and that kind of thing. But from a personal, professional perspective, it's a recognition that what works in one place doesn't necessarily work everywhere. Top-down policies defining sustainability across the country don't necessarily work. And I'm reminded here of a planning inquiry I helped organise probably 10, 12 years ago when I was in-house in public sector, but in a rural authority. This was a deck wind farm, so above 50 megawatt, big 20, 23 turbine wind farm in the countryside, and very much a rural authority. But of course, it's deck organised, not PINS and local planning authority at this point. So it's very much London-centric in terms of the administration going into that. And they had a new policy in place back in the early 2010s about sustainable planning appeals and how they had to be on inquiry venues near public transport, trains, buses, everything else. Well, in rural Lincolnshire, that just doesn't happen. And we had to persuade London-centric organisers that actually the community that were objecting to that wind farm would car share, because there were only buses every other day, 3 days a week probably in that location, but the community got together, they worked together, and it was still sustainable because it was picked to be a closer venue than one that was 20 miles away on bus routes. So different things for different perspectives. From a planning law sense, it's a recognition that sustainability is gaining a policy and legal footing. Already mentioned on one of the first slides of the afternoon, the new MPPF. That brought in support for net zero 2050, whole life carbon. It moved us from just net gain, biodiversity net gain in the previous MPPF, to putting the statutory 10% into a policy footing as well.
So, thanks, Stuart. Anything else to add from the...
Yeah, I think for me it's gone from being a kind of a niche thing, talking about sustainability. People used to very much roll their eyes at me when I was banging the drum a few years back, to now being recognised as actually being a real core driver of value for clients as well. So it's not just doing the right thing, it also can be a really valuable asset if you start future-proofing your buildings and looking to maximise that. So for me, it's really reassuring to see those two slowly coming together, because I think without the money behind it, you can't drive these kind of changes. So I think it's a really exciting time for sustainability from that point of view.
Absolutely. And I think key is you work with investors and developers in commercial property across the real estate life cycle. So what are the main challenges that you and your clients encounter as they try to future-proof their assets and plan on that sustainable future front?
Where to begin with that? I think Rob's word cloud at the beginning was really interesting, actually, because economic climate and the sort of instability around the markets is always the key one. A lot of our developers, I know they say that construction-wise, the first thing they'll ditch, unfortunately, will be anything sustainable related that isn't essential, because it's just a bit costly. So I think lack of kind of regulatory and statutory footing for lots of these things, until things are mandated, it can be quite hard to drive that change. So I think for clients, that uncertainty doesn't help them. We see that with things like, obviously, the government have dialed down a little bit on the net zero goals recently, EPCs as well with the MEES regs. The projection is to have EPC C by 2027 and EPC B by 2030, but that's obviously just a perspective idea, and I think something like 73 or 75% of commercial properties below a C at the moment, so that's obviously a huge challenge for the commercial sector, and I think Resi is probably in a similar boat. So, there is a lot to be done there. Another challenge is basically collaborating with tenants as well. So someone else said collaboration today, it might have been Rob again, and I was like, yes, that's the buzzword that I always bang on about, collaborating. But unless you bring tenants on that journey with you as landlords, it's going to be very hard to work together. Pushing towards net zero carbon goals, we're obviously not just looking at embodied carbon, but we're looking at operational carbon as well, so the day-to-day usage of the building. So you need to have that data from tenants, so that could be a real challenge, is getting kind of live operational data from tenants. If you're having to rely on it to be manually read and brought back to you, it's out of time, it might not be accurate. So trying to put wording into leases to get that information from tenants and work together with them to get live data, I think is a huge challenge. And then lastly, I think the lending side, I don't know if we've got any lenders here today, but I think the lending can lag a little bit behind. I saw an article in Green Street News yesterday, actually, which I thought was quite timely, which was developers were saying only 30% of developers thought there was sort of sustainable financing available for them, and even smaller number kind of knew properly what those terms were. So until there were those incentives in place to kind of encourage the investment in sustainability, particularly things like impact investing, because we talk a lot about the S in the ESG, but the social side, sorry, the S in that, doesn't always get picked up as much because the money isn't there. So I think until all of this comes together with some regulation and some more investing, it's quite hard to drive that change.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think it was a recent real estate conference where the social part was a real talking point of how do you one, how do you sort of understand the possibilities, but then how do you measure it and how do you actually influence it against that? Now Paul, obviously we work with a lot of organisations across the same sort of sector, any sort of thing to add to that side?
Yeah, I mean, at a more granular level, it's almost like they don't really know where to start necessarily, and that can be stripping right back to basic to even helping them identify firstly what they do own, and then once that's in place, you know, what kind of condition is this in, and then with limited resource and limited investment, you know, where do you go to hit retrofit first, and where do you get those kind of small wins? And then the other challenge that they come to us about quite regularly is trying to understand the local area in its context and the locality, really, just to see the impact that planning changes have, that environmental changes have, that population changes have, and then how they sort of either benefit from the opportunities that develops or mitigate against it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, it's a similar sort of statement of that development for place and considering that in a sustainable term as well as the traditional environmental sort of factors that come into it as well. So I guess as we start to sort of look further ahead, and Stuart, I'm going to come back to you for this one, what sort of emerging trends in sustainability, particularly across some of the government planning policies you've mentioned, what do you think will have the most significant impact? That could go anywhere, couldn't it? But from your perspective, what do you think will have the most significant impact across the industry over the next 5 years?
Well, I've just jotted down maybe three things, so not one with the most, but net zero, and I think there is a difference here between London, the cities, the regions, and everywhere else, so to speak, in that there's a number of planning policies still, thought about build to rent and things that you see start in London, and it's a slow drift out. And I spoke at even a build to rent conference a couple of years ago, and in researching for that, realised that even Birmingham and Manchester, as our second biggest cities, didn't even have build-to-rent policies, which London has done quite well. So in terms of net zero, which is, I think, fitted in this city quite well, how will that follow in the regions, rural, and particularly areas where land values don't make those demands as easy? If you're looking at land values and the way that then sort of bounces on, there is a very, very heavy emphasis on affordable housing within government rhetoric, even the spending review yesterday. My take on that is that we need to get more creative ways of delivering this if we're also going to deliver sustainability, BNG, net zero, everything that's being loaded onto the developers' balance sheets. There is only so much money that can come out of any development, any property holding, and we kind of need to work out what our priorities are and how that comes out of it. And I then think the other trend is something we've clearly spoken a lot about today, that's digitisation and AI. I just made a note as the last speaker was on, DocuSign, if only we could get local authorities to adopt it as well. Then that and a few other tweaks to the 106 system would probably take a document that in the HBF report last week is now taking over 2 years to complete your average 106. That could be sped up so much if we standardised it properly, got commercial buy-in to those standardised documents, used tech creatively rather than waiting for a local authority lawyer to wait for it to get to the top of their to-do sheet. And then after that, use DocuSign properly. I think I've dealt with maybe 5 local authorities in the last year or two that even comprehend some version of electronic signature. And I think that links in with government announcements yesterday that central government's looking at Extract AI and a few other products. Why can't our local authorities be a bit more led on that? And I think the answer to that is lack of resourcing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stuart. And I think it was one of the other sort of topics at the start of this in terms of Law Society guidance on climate change. So, Louise, how do you see that impacting advice that you provide to clients?
Well, that's the hot topic, isn't it?
Yes.
It's going to divide the room, I think.
You're welcome.
I was interested in the figures, actually. I'm hoping they might have changed slightly now that we've had the actual guidance note as opposed to the sort of consultation last year. I actually thought it was quite a pragmatic note. It was a lot better than I was expecting it to be from the kind of scaremongering of what we're going to have to think about. I think I'm going to be... No, I'll carry on. I thought it was quite sensible. As a firm, I mean, we're just speaking with our risk team, but I think the approach we're going to take is that because obviously with the climate change, some of it is outside the comfort zone of what we would traditionally be advising on as lawyers. So obviously I think most of you know this, but you've got your kind of physical risk, which is your fires, your floods, your coastal erosion. Then you've got the transitional risk. So that's kind of the legislation to go around that. So on the path to net zero carbon, etc. And then there's what the Law Society note terms the legal or the liability risk. So that is the implications of those other risks, basically. So that's things that our clients might have to think about, like MEES, penalties, complying with planning obligations around flood risks, etc., any kind of other building regs that might come in. And I think that third area is where we're more comfortable as lawyers and advising on. It's something we'd be looking at anyway. So the way I think we're probably going to end up approaching it as a firm, certainly, and I know from speaking to other KDLs at other firms, most of us seem to be in the same boat, is that we'll probably not be carrying out climate change searches as standard for our commercial clients. We'll get them if they're requested by the clients or the lenders, but we'll certainly always be flagging to clients that there could be a risk of climate change and they should get kind of specialist surveyors and specialist advice for them, because I think it just goes a little bit out of our comfort zone. I think we've got ourselves comfortable with that as an approach, and I think the Law Society's note kind of supports that in terms of thinking about it very reasonable and the wording that they suggest to put into reports on title. So yeah, I think it's fairly sensible, not as drastic as I'd feared, but obviously something that we always have to have in mind because clients are obviously always looking to future-proof their buildings.
And I think it's interesting then seeing it sort of echoed, like you say, through to clients, both across sort of any part of the market in terms of their expectations of reviewing climate change and other basis. From our perspective and working on the sort of geospatial data side and the provision of that, what we're seeing is those sort of changing appetites to be wanting to understand some of those risks earlier, but also practically being able to act on them, because it's all well and good us understanding risk, but it's the action that typically the clients are looking towards as we move through those. And look, I'm going to come back again, Louise, on this side of things as we talk around another topic. So experience around green leases and another sort of, I guess, interpretation in the sustainability world. Do you encounter many sort of challenges negotiating these, and what are the expectations with regards to your clients on that side of things?
I mean, that's changed a lot recently. So it used to be that kind of you would only be putting in provisions about EPCs into your leases, and that was pretty much it. Now I'd say a lot of what we call the lighter green drafting has actually become quite standard. It's almost boilerplate for our clients, and especially when the certificate of title obviously started to first touch upon its green lease. So it's just recent that 8th edition says you've got to kind of put in provisions around tenants, alterations not affecting EPCs, landlord controls on EPCs, and then also data sharing. So certificate of title actually provides for mutual data sharing. It assumes that both landlords and tenants will be sharing their data around the building's usage. I'd say in the green lease drafting, landlords typically resist it being landlord side. They want it a tenant-only obligation. So we do see a real challenge in terms of wanting that to be mutual when tenants push back. Some of our landlords are more aspirational and happy. Others seem much more reluctant and kind of want to share that data. So I think there's an educational piece there around kind of collaboration again, and the more data that you can share and have, the better those operational performances will be. So that can be a bit of a challenge. Another challenge is always who's going to bear the cost of things, so cost of improving environmental performances and carrying out works to bring the buildings up to scratch. That's always a real bugbear. Obviously, there's the longer term look. If a tenant's got a longer lease, it actually could be saving the money in the long term in terms of lowering their energy bills, etc. But for shorter term leases, that's a much harder sell, so that tends to be a landlord cost. So we always have inevitable toing and froing on those. I don't know if everyone in the room is familiar with the Green Lease Toolkit that the Better Building Partnership, they brought out a new version just recently, and I think that's a really useful tool. I don't know if anyone's had a look at it, but that's got kind of light, medium and dark green aspirational kind of drafting in there, so I think that's really good. We put in darker green lease drafting for a client about 3 years ago at their request, quite a big landlord client, to use across 2 estates. And it was really interesting because at the time we put it in, people were just laughing in our faces saying, you are never going to get tenants to agree this. And actually at the beginning, they really weren't. It was a bit of a disaster. But in the last 18 months or so, lots of tenants are really happy to accept the darker green. And we've even had a couple of tenants coming with their own green agendas. They know what they want as a company. So they are actually pushing landlords to have those clauses in the leases. So I think tenants are really starting to see the attraction in having sustainable buildings with a real focus on the green leasing. So it's getting less of a challenge, in short.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you say, we see it also from the landlord side and the developer side, particularly when it comes to redevelopment, that actually having availability of green leases and sort of the recognition of the value of those in your offer to your market. So whether you're being office or whether it's sort of workplace, actually the tenants and maybe their sort of employees or the sort of tenants on that side is all around that being recognised as a value add as part of working within an opportunity, and it's definitely something we're seeing across some of the developer side. So really fascinating across those. So we've talked through, I guess, a lot of topics today were across sort of change management and managing change across those. And obviously, with regards to those planning policy changes, Stuart, there's been significant. So you talked about sort of where you'd see it going in the future and sort of forward-facing, but which of those have most sort of resonated into your client base or sort of been highlighted so much for immediate action? And sort of, are there any aspects of that you sort of see maybe have flown under the radar a bit, but actually could have considerable impact?
I think the thing that resonates most is just the volume of it. I spoke at an event last week and rattled through the various consultations or changes that have come out under the new government, and they've not been in, I think they were in about 11 months as of middle of last week. We started sort of in the lead up to Christmas with brownfield consultations, right to buy, older people, reforming committees. We then got the new MPPF that had been consulted on since probably 3 or 4 weeks into the Labour government, supported by new MPPG. We crossed into the new year with fee changes, a DEFRA land use framework, and then the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and a lot of changes in that, including, very relevant for sustainability, the nature recovery funds. And as we speak, we've then moved into, there's another 6 or 7 consultations out at the moment that close into July. Speed up build out, which has probably got the wrong political rhetoric. We're back into whether or not developers are land banking. Whether or not net gain should apply to smaller sites, and there's a real conversation I think to be had as the best way to bring in biodiversity net gain for the country. Whether you would get bigger and better gains if small to medium sites weren't necessarily bothered with the immediate intricacies of whether to put an extra couple of wildflower beds, but to invest some of that money in proper wide-scale improvements on larger habitat banks. Reforming the site thresholds, and the one that really stands out to me as having potential to have big changes, the committee changes. Slight step away from the full sustainability topic, but it's been labelled as anti-democratic, and I just don't agree that it is. It's probably, if it can come forward right, it would have one of the bigger changes, along with, I think, proper digitisation and speeding up 106s. You would then stop a 3-4 stage process with, if it's an allocated site, it's already been voted on, it's been in a local plan, people have had their say, and we need to get better engagement in the first stage of that, when people do have their say.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess also one of the most sustainable things is the sheer volume of change that you can continue to expect. And as we've sort of mentioned a couple of times, we work across across that sort of land and property and sector. So, Paul, anything to add from your side with the volume of change?
Private sector, we're seeing sort of 3 key drivers that have come from NPPF. The first of those is the emergence, one of Stuart's favourite terms, is the grey belt land. What does that mean? What are the opportunities? What's the definition? How many more colours can we possibly bring to classification of land? And obviously that generates a lot of conversation, but it has got people interested in talking about planning. Second real driver is the mandatory housing targets, which are sort of beyond levels of ambition that we've seen in this country for years, not since the sort of start of the 1970s, after the sort of post-war build, have we seen anything like the kind of numbers that are expected. And obviously as a country we're nowhere near it at the moment, but from a developer's point of view that's exciting. It's prompted them, it's given them a prompt to look for change legislatively, and whether they can improve some of the processes that they use off the back of it. And then the third key driver is the emergence of the sustainable growth areas that we're looking at economically, where we're clearly positioning ourselves as a country to be the sort of scientific and tech leaders, because particular regard is going to be given to planning applications that include things like laboratories, gigafactories, digital infrastructure, freight, logistics, anything like that. So, that's got our sort of multidisciplinary surveyors and site developers and planners excited about sort of where they can go with that. What's flown under the radar, but one of the things that I think is quite interesting, is it's brought the concept of strategic planning into local authorities. And I'll give a shout out to my home area of Greater Manchester here. Is the Greater Manchester Strategic Plan is being held up as a real beneficial leader in the way that they've done their strategic plan. But the idea being that the local authorities can now sort of not just have a housing policy, but they can combine it with their transport, their infrastructure policy, their economic and their environmental policy, and sort of bring it all together, which makes a lot more sense and gives us a sort of clearer view and outlook of sort of where we're going as a country.
Fabulous, thank you, Paul. So final question from my side before I hand over the reins to the room. Reins, it almost works. And Louise, I'll come to you first. So what advice would you give to other organisations to looking to enhance their sustainability practices? And what you mentioned collaboration earlier. What are the true opportunities that lie within that?
I mean, I think there's huge opportunities. As I alluded at the start, it crosses so many sectors and spheres. There's so much work. You know, we're talking about it with all of our clients. So I would say it's really, can you still hear? I'd say it's really useful to kind of work with the different departments in your firms and kind of see what everybody else is doing. Obviously, speak to clients a lot. There's also lots of organisations that you can tap into to either help with kind of research or feeding in. So we work with the Chancery Lane project, or looking at kind of their green lease clauses. We're also working with the BPF, the British Property Federation. So I don't know if some of you saw, but they're asking for people to get involved with looking at solar power, which is something we're very keen on as a firm. So I haven't really touched on renewable energy, but that's something that like a lot of our clients are looking at, whether that's, we do a lot in the industrials logistics sector. So obviously they've got the lovely flat, big shed roofs to use, but there are also other perspectives there. So I would say kind of look at those organisations to get a bit more guidance. I mentioned the Better Building Partnership as well. They're always looking for people to collaborate and kind of sharing what they're seeing in terms of drafting in the market, and kind of they're always looking for more feedback. And talking to the agents as well. Like, we do a lot with Savills. They're kind of lots of research into what people are seeing in the market, looking at European. I don't know if some of you saw the discussion yesterday. I think it's the Department of Energy put out a consultation on having solar canopies in car parks. So in France, some of Europe, they have those as mandatory. So the consultation is talking on making it mandatory for new car parks and car parks over a certain size that are in existence, maybe having those insisting on having canopies as well. So that's just an example of where you can feed in, because a lot of our clients are quite excited about that area. So I think there's so much potential out there. I'm really passionate about it, as you can hopefully tell. Yes, so I think, get out there and talk to everybody and see what you can get involved in.
And anything to add from you?
Yeah, I think it's echo that. It's collaboration and it's balance, like we said at the start. It's the idea that, look, in solar, there was a stat put out at Reef a couple of weeks ago that there are so many sort of big shed spaces with solar panels on the roof where there isn't even a local grid connection for that excess to go back into the grid. So it either needs to be stored on site in battery for the evenings, or it's just wasted and lost. So there's a number of tracks moving at the moment, and the government's rhetoric on housing is so far ahead of maybe some of the rhetoric on infrastructure and other parts to that. And I think the other part of that balance and collaboration is, look, particularly in BNG, I'm seeing so much more opportunity in engaging in the private sector than necessarily the public sector. When it comes to BNG, you can secure it with a conservation covenant or a 106 agreement. The speed at which I can now do a conservation covenant with a private responsible body over a local authority who are in most cases still trying to work out which bit of the past draft is the right one for them to use, whereas the 40 or so responsible bodies have got fairly established conservation covenants and can rattle those things out quite quickly now.
Absolutely.
And I would just add, it's not a surprise to anyone really, but to echo what the other panellists are saying, is to unlock and harness the power of data. It provides analysis and insight and answers that maybe we haven't considered when we ask it the right questions, taking on Catherine's philosophy, the people and the bots. You use the data in that way. I've seen the formats and the availability and the interoperability of it come tenfold forward in the 15 years that I've been involved with it. So my sort of message to you guys is keep challenging data providers to get the innovation out there, and then let's use the data to achieve what we've been discussing all day here this afternoon.
Actually, just on that, I think Rob would kill me if I didn't add. As a firm, we're really working towards net zero, so we actually collaborate with suppliers and key clients. So again, on the data front, we've collaborated with SearchFlow, so we speak quarterly, and we're actually sharing how we're trying to harness our respective firms' data to work towards net zero carbon. SearchFlow are definitely beating us at the moment. It's very annoying. But that has been a really useful forum to kind of share ideas, because obviously we're all working towards common goals, so it's quite nice to cut through any kind of competitive. Collaboration is really useful.
Fabulous. Completely agree. I think those topics of collaborations, data, and working within those processes are so key. So as mentioned, it's over to you guys now for any sort of follow-on questions as we continue on with the panel.
Everyone wants a drink on the terrace.
We've got one coming through. Yeah, we are on the way up to the top bar. I do appreciate that.
I don't know necessarily who this would be relevant to, but considering all the talk there has been of AI today, from from an ESG perspective, I don't know whether you've got any opinions on how environmentally friendly the use of AI is, because there's just been talk of the cost of that from an environmental perspective.
It's something that we've talked about a lot as a firm, actually, because you read really conflicting things about it. I think depending on who's putting out the agenda. I think it is quite data as intensive. There's been debate about whether, well, actually, if the AI can get it quicker than us spending sort of 3 hours on Google, does that actually therefore translate? You know, it's very hard to compare, I think, and there hasn't been enough data released to be sure, but it is something that we are very aware of. It's kind of getting that balance right about using it astutely. At the moment, I think everyone's testing it like crazy because they just want to get behind it, but I think it's definitely something we need to be aware of. And obviously, you're having to have these huge data centers driving those. So again, that's another issue. It's like the energy use of those, getting those in locations. So I think that's going to be something that's going to be very much at the forefront of people's minds once the kind of exciting buzz dies down a bit.
Completely agree. I listened to a talk recently from a environmental charity based at sort of looking across globally around environmental risks, and they're leveraging AI to identify potential risks against sort of wildfires and those sorts of things in other countries across the world. And it was that exact question was asked, well, how do you justify the sustainability of using AI versus the benefits you're getting out? And it's sort of similar to that question of ROI from a monetary point of view. From my perspective, it's got to be focusing around the value that's being contributed to the solution that you're trying to get to, and the justification that has. If it's around sort of high volume consistent uses for not much value, that's where we have to question ourselves and as organizations be strict about the usage and having policies in place that drive value-based usage of AI. Any more questions as I look around the room? I've got one at the back.
Luke from Landmark. So Stuart, probably one for you. Around B&G, I know we spoke last year, I think a few times around B&G and the legislation. Kind of well over 12 months on from the legislation now, and I've heard a few conversations around individuals thinking that it needs to be the legislation needs to be softened. I just wanted to get your views on how you think being on the front line the last 12 months have been, and do you believe that, or do you think actually it's been a positive 12 months and we've talked about change quite a lot today, but actually is it positive and people will just get on with it?
I think it's genuinely too soon to tell, because in reality, a lot of the 106s on my desk are still pre-BNG applications. It's been compulsory in application since February, April last year, depending on what you're talking about. And probably the majority of things still coming through are applications made before that date. I think the scale of delay at local authority level is not widely understood, although HBF reported on it only a couple of weeks ago. My personal perspective is that there's probably two levers to pull, and that's firstly that putting this on every single site is at the smallest level is not a great thing. We're going to get the kind of wholesale improvement across the country we need by making big wholesale improvements, by investing in off-site habitat banks and the like. And I think the off-site market is probably the biggest success here. The private habitat banks that have done conservation covenants and are already making improvements in land and paying for them with the sale of those units. The biggest delay seems to be what is an extremely grey area of government policy, which lumps straight back to local authorities the idea that they need to work it out in the determination process, even though BNG is controlled with a post-consent condition. And if you roll back 4 or 5 years, you'll remember that we put on a blacklist any sort of pre-commencement conditions. We shouldn't have been doing them. They were supposed to be used in very rare occasions. Roll forward to 2024, and nearly every planning permission will now have a pre-commencement condition on it to go in with a game plan. So we've left local authorities with this sort of question mark of, are you okay to grant it with the pre-commencement condition and the game plan? So you have to do enough during the determination process to persuade the authority that it's capable of discharge. What that is in every local authority, 300 plus authorities, will be slightly different, and it's created a several different avenues down that rather than one consistent path. And I think that's one of the biggest things I'd change is, and it may be coming in the current paper that's being consulted on, are small, medium-sized sites taken out of this. If they're just taken out of it, actually put an environmental hat on, and I think the government have probably gone too far the other way, because what needs to find its way into the system is some steer to best design on site, and if that means you've got a 5 or 6% gain, then an effective locally set, and by locally set I mean in accordance with local land values, not locally set by each and every local authority like SIL, but a locally informed roof tax, so to speak, so that those that are under the 10% put something back into the greater good, and then the greater good is larger habitat banks creating that sort of improvement. Because the other smaller part of this is that the BNG done properly is one of the best things for this country. We are one of the least biodiverse countries in the world. But it's not necessarily always the nicest thing to have on your doorstep. If you're thinking of a new build estate, 20, 30 houses, you want your public open space to be mown, not left overgrown for weeks on end. You don't want creepy crawlies in your kids' picnic lunch. And I always at this point use the example of our rugby club, which in summer training drains downhill, there's a copse of woodland and then a railway station. You need an absolute ton of bug spray to get through a summer training session. That's what we're trying to now integrate into every housing estate, which is not necessarily what you want on your doorstep, but it is what you want in the country.
Final call for any more? In which case, I'll ask everyone to put their hands together for the panelists today.